to the next speaker just to smooth the process. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much for having me here today. My part-time job is as a physician, and I am a full-time environmental health scientist at UC Berkeley, and have been looking over the past year and a half or so of being a senior research fellow for the U.S. Green Building Council at some of the ways that the materials that make up our built environment may be affecting our health. And so one of the things that has really struck me in this year of learning more about the built environment and building materials is how much the built environment has changed over the last half century or so, and that really buildings have become these complex assemblies of hundreds, even thousands of materials. And at the same time that those new materials have enabled gains in efficiency and performance, they have also increased in chemical intensiveness, and their sheer variety and complexity has really changed how the built environment affects human health in other respects. The built environment now relies, instead of primarily, on brick and wood or similarly harmful substances such as lead and asbestos. I don't want to completely give the past a free pass. It now relies on a wide variety of polymers, composites, adhesives, sealants, foams, coatings, etc. And these are all mixtures, and they're primarily designed for high performance and function, with very few requirements for testing their safety. And as a result, we know very little about a lot of their impacts on human health, and we haven't been able to use those impacts as design criteria. So the signals aren't sort of passing down the line. I'd like right now, in my 5 to 7 minutes, to take a very brief tour through some of the examples of modern materials in the built environment and the health effects of their constituent chemicals, just to have some examples of what we're talking about today. And underlying all of this is the need, as we've already heard several times, to think about the full life cycle of materials. So often when, specifically as architects or building designers, we're thinking about occupancy phase, and that's sort of what we think of as the use phase of a material. But very often, the majority of the health impact lies outside that use phase, and it's in the manufacture or the construction phase or at the end of life. And I think we need to be thinking about materials in a really holistic sense in that way. So here is a brief tour through some of the bad news. You've heard already today a mention of asthmagens, so some examples of some common hazards. While, of course, there are many factors that contribute to asthma, chemicals such as the isocyanates that are used in the polyurethane spray foam insulation that is so great with energy efficiency and filling cracks, is that class of chemicals, isocyanates, are one of the single largest known causes of work-related asthma. They're sensitizers. A notorious carcinogen, formaldehyde, which has already come up today, also can be emitted from the glues that are used in a variety of wood composites, such as the one there, that's sometimes in building assemblies, but also in furnishings. Also, it is sometimes the furnishings themselves or the finishes that are the largest source of chemical hazards in the built environment. So a couple examples of endocrine disruptors in finishes include the perfluorinated surfactants that form the stain-resistant or water-repellent coatings on a lot of textiles and furnishings. They're known endocrine disruptors, which, as you already heard, means that they can interfere with the body's normal signaling process that guides development, reproduction, and sort of even in adults, homeostasis. Many high-performance coatings, such as epoxy-based floors is the one I picked out to show, but there are many, rely on badge, which is a chemical that's made from BPA, a known endocrine disruptor, and epichlorohydrin, which is a reproductive toxicant and also a suspected carcinogen. And then to get onto the level of neurotoxicants, one of the earliest recognized neurotoxicants is, of course, lead, associated with lower IQ and behavioral problems in children who are exposed during early development, and also there are health effects in adults like high blood pressure. and the phthalate plasticizers that are commonly added to PVC to make it flexible, but that readily migrate out of the material. They don't stay in the PVC, and they migrate into the indoor environment. They're known reproductive toxicants with particularly important effects for boys who are exposed during prenatal development. It's a quick tour of some bad actors, although there are more than that. In fact, we know that although some of these materials really may seem inert, their constituent chemicals do migrate out of them and into the surrounding evidence. And we know from biomonitoring evidence that chemicals in the environment, whether the indoor or outdoor environment, get into us. So, and that's through, the air we breathe and the food we eat, but also through just absorption through our skin, either from the air or from things we touch, or from non-food ingestion of dust, which sounds odd, like we don't eat dust, right? But we do actually, and especially little kids who are on the floor eat a lot of dust, but even adults eat dust. So this is just a condensation of some of the biomonitoring data that CDC produces. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention regularly screens a representative sample of the U.S. population for over about 200 substances, synthetic chemicals and pollutants, and detects many of them in the majority of people tested. We don't always know where these are coming from, but we can point to some of the chemicals that we know are used in the built environment. So just to highlight a few from here, the environmental phenols includes bisphenol A, that's in badge, pesticides and insecticides that sometimes are used indoors, but often are tracked indoors when used around buildings. Metals, of course, perfluorinated surfactants that are on a lot of surface treatments, phthalates that I mentioned that are used in PVC often in the built environment, and of course volatile organic compounds. I seem to have repeated the metals. I'll have to take that out. PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, that are one of the types of flame retardants that have come into widespread use in the built environment. And also this long name there is basically for furans and dioxins that are products of combustion. And that happens anytime you burn something that's chlorinated or brominated, so plastics or anything that has been treated with a flame retardant. So that's more of an end-of-life issue. And so, as I said, we really want to think, when looking at where the hazard comes from the chemicals that are in materials, we need to look beyond the use phase. Sometimes it is the occupants that are the most at risk from an exposure, but sometimes it's well outside of that. So when we think of the entire life cycle from starting at like 11 o'clock there, from the extraction of materials through manufacture, through construction, and the occupancy phase on the lower right, through the end of life, whether it's dramatic demolition or just the passage of time and erosion of materials, a lot of the impact that we can anticipate from the chemicals in materials actually doesn't happen when we're sitting here in this room. But we need to, if we're thinking about designing safer buildings, think about all of the people for whom those materials might pose some hazards. So looking at a couple of examples in material extraction, say when the EU made a wholesale transition to CFLs, the shuttered mercury mines in China were reopened to provide even the small amount of mercury that's in each compact fluorescent caused widespread mercury poisoning among the workers and also the surrounding environment. Manufacturing and construction are phases when many of the sort of coatings, sealants, and insulation materials their chemicals are in their sort of raw form and workers are exposed. So finally, I just want to say one word about the importance of worker exposures. In some sense, even building occupants, of course, are workers, but I want to think about the other work that's being done that involves the manufacturing or installation of materials used in the built environment, because it involves close contact with hazardous substances. Often workers are disproportionately affected by the diseases that are linked to chemical exposures, and it's an underestimate, but it's estimated that there's 60,000 premature deaths per year attributable to occupational diseases. That's not injuries. and fatalities from that. It's diseases, and of course not all of those are chemically related, but some portion of them are. And we think that OSHA controls this right by setting permissible exposure limits, and yet they're only set for 7% of even the 3,000 highest production volume chemicals in the U.S., and of those, the California EPA looked at those PELs, and for 6 of those common workplace chemicals, they found that the cancer risk for exposure at the permissible exposure limit was 1 in 10, which is a pretty unacceptable exposure risk. And of course, it's often immigrants, minorities, and low-income workers who are disproportionately affected. So my closing question, with all of that information in mind, is how do we create from all of this bad news the positive design criteria, moving beyond red lists, lists of substances to avoid, to actually give meaningful cues to manufacturers of materials and also those who design and build the buildings in which we work and live. Thanks.